Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Miller, professor at the Fletcher School, author of Chip War, and delighted to host this Intelligence Squared podcast with Dan Wang, the author of this extraordinary new book, Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Delighted to welcome Dan for this conversation about both the book and the broader intellectual trajectory that led him to write it. So first off, welcome, Dan. Thanks for spending time with me today to discuss the book. To start, I thought I could ask you to kind of lay out the main argument of Breakneck. You look at China, you look at the United States, and you argue that they have two different types of societies and political systems, one defined by engineers, the other defined by lawyers. Can you help us understand this dichotomy and the way that it shapes both how China and the US function differently?
Chris, it's my total pleasure to be here in conversation with you. So, Breakneck is a meditation on, I think, the 6 years I spent in China from 2017 to 2023, thinking quite a bit about China as well as the US, where I'm also pretty familiar. And I approach both of these countries as a Canadian who has spent quite a bit of time living in both countries. And I find both countries very intellectually thrilling, intellectually bizarre, and both really big, world-changing countries. And the framework that I have to really try to understand both of these places is that China is a country I call the engineering state. Because at various points, the entirety of the topmost senior leadership have had degrees in engineering. And this is engineering of a very Soviet sort, in which people majored in geology or thermal engineering or all sorts of mechanical engineering. And the issue with engineers is that they sort of treat every problem as if construction were the solution. So China's a country that builds endless highways, tall bridges, coal plants, nuclear plants, homes, hyperscalers, you name it. China is really building a lot of these things. And the issue with engineers is that they also treat society and the population almost as if it were an engineering exercise. So I also spend a lot of time thinking about the one child policy as well as zero COVID, which I lived through, in which the Politburo is really treating society as just a giant math exercise. The numbers right there in the name. And I contrast China with the US, which I call the lawyerly society, because all the presidents have to go to Yale Law School. The issue with lawyers is that they block everything, good and bad. If you take a look at the US Congress, about half to a third of all members of Congress would have degrees in law. Very few of them have any sort of STEM degrees. The issue with lawyers is that they block everything, good and bad. So you don't have stupid ideas like the one child policy. You also don't have very functional infrastructure, not even where you are, Chris, with Boston, and where I was with Yale Law School. Even in that relatively well-connected part of the country, the trains and the highways don't work all that well.
When you based your conclusions after living both in the US, but also in China, and when you were in China, you wrote a newsletter that had a cult following, I would say, among China watchers and many others that illustrated how you spent each year you lived in China. And one of the things that I enjoyed the most about first reading that newsletter and then watching it evolve into some of the conclusions of the book was the ways that your personal experiences shaped these conclusions. So your bike trips, for example, deep into rural China, helped you understand just the depths to which the engineering state had actually built extraordinary highways and functional high-speed rail. Can you talk about the evolution of the ideas that led to this book from bike trip to a finished book?
Sure. I moved to China at the start of the first Trump administration, at the start of 2017. And so over 6 years, I lived for 2 years in Hong Kong, 2 years in Beijing, and then 2 years in Shanghai. And, thinking a little bit about the evolution of my own thinking about the evolution of US-China relations, I was in China mostly to be a technology analyst. So I was working for an investment research firm, really trying to figure out the trajectory of China's clean tech development, semiconductor development, science development. And at the time that I moved there, China was known as a country that was still mostly doing a lot of copying. It was alleged that the US government has alleged that China has stolen quite a lot of American IP. And China was also trying to build a big mass of its own manufacturing capabilities. And so that's one of these stories that I saw that evolved over the time that I was there. Again, between 2017 and 2023, I saw this story that changed from China being mostly a thief and a copycat into a country that is pretty dominant in a lot of technologies today. Not yet on chips, which you know so much better than me about, Chris, but on something like electric vehicles, consumer drones, China is an indisputable leader. There's another sort of trajectory that I also lived through in China, which is the entirety of the zero COVID experience. So I was in Beijing at the start of 2020 when Wuhan locked down and Beijing itself was in a sort of a softer lockdown. And so there were a lot of questions about whether China was going to be able to handle the initial stages of the COVID pandemic. There were a lot of foreign commentators who were saying something like, oh, this is going to be a Chernobyl moment for China's Communist Party, meaning a big disaster that eventually triggers a political meltdown as well. And certainly in 2020, it felt like a really odd time to be living in China. There were so many different variables here. There was so much uncertainty. But the first act of COVID, I would say, was a lot of this uncertainty with China's experience of pandemic control. The second act turned out that, well, it looks like the rest of the world really couldn't handle this quite as well. There were a lot of doubts about, again, Trump's final year in office in 2020. Europe didn't seem to handle it terribly well. And by 2021, it looked like China was actually managing to achieve a pretty good job with a fairly open society internally within this zero COVID framework that was mostly sealed off from the rest of the world, but keeping life relatively normal at home and then having basically no deaths related to COVID. And then there was a third act to COVID in which the entire zero COVID system fell apart in 2022 after a much more transmissible strain of COVID started ravaging cities like Shanghai, where I was living. We saw China's largest city in a state of lockdown where most people couldn't leave their apartment compounds for a matter of 2 months. And then everything came crashing down. And so, trying to write a little bit about China's early success, which led to hubris, which led to a collapse and then, a smashing apart of all sorts of relations in society because people were very deeply upset about the extent of zero COVID. These were sort of the moods that I was trying to encapsulate, a little bit of, writing the first draft of history.
When I love your point about whether it's zero COVID, the one child policy, everything being quantifiable in terms of policy outcomes, I think that's a really insightful way to think about how the Chinese political system thinks about policy. I'd love to get your sense as to why it is that China ended up with this engineering state. I could see one explanation going back to what you referenced as sort of the Soviet style, the political system. Another being sort of more macroeconomically focused. China's at a point in its development where it needs to deepen its capital stock. And so doing a lot of building made a lot of macroeconomic sense, at least for a time. There are probably some sociological explanations one could bring to bear. Why is it that China ended up with this particular model?
The first point that I would make is to try to draw things a little bit back further into history. So, if we think about the lawyerly society, the US has been lawyerly since its very founding. Something like the Declaration of Independence almost reads like a legal text drafted by Jefferson. If we take a look at the founding fathers, most of them were lawyers. And if we take a look at America's first 16 presidents, from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln, all but 3 of them have been lawyers at some point in their lives. And so there's a little bit of a historical antecedent to America as a lawyerly society. And I want to draw out some of these historical resonances with China as well. Now, I don't want to be overly literal about this framework of the engineers. I want to say that, there's a lot of frameworks that we have to try to reason about the US and China, and all of them are pretty bad. I don't really enjoy using these 20th century terms like socialist or neoliberal or authoritarian to describe either the US or China. And I don't want to say that the engineering is everything, but there are some aspects of engineering within China's heritage as well, in which the emperors really conscripted a lot of people to build great walls or grand canals to repel the nomadic tribes in the north, or to build this big waterway system to connect the north as well as the south. And so, and you can also sort of imagine that a lot of these emperors barely hesitated to completely reorder a peasant's relationship to her land. And so that's one aspect that I draw on. There's another aspect that I draw on, as you say, macroeconomically, in which China really focused on construction to be able to really establish its economy as well as the Communist Party's political legitimacy. So one of the things that I was really surprised by was that China constructed its first highway in only 1993. That's pretty recently to establish its first highway. But if you were someone who was born in the year that China built its first highway, by the time you reached the legal driving age of 18 in China, you would be able to drive on a highway system that was as extensive as America's. So within 18 years, China built one America's worth of highways. And then 9 years later, China built another America's worth of highways, and they're still building a lot. So when you take a look at highways, high-speed rail, power plants, container ports, all sorts of things, China really, really tried to build a lot here, in part because they also had this Soviet influence. And so these are sort of the strings that I pull on to say that, historically, economically, in terms of political ideology, China is indeed much more authoritarian than the US. There are fewer lawyers really to try to stop these autocratic tendencies to force people to stay at home or to give up their child, and to suffer much worse if you're an ethno-religious minority in China. And so, there is this combination of authoritarianism, political legitimacy, economic growth, as well as history, that really kind of seems like there are a bunch of engineers regulating society as if it's a series of pipes.
Well, let's turn then and contrast that with the U.S., which you describe as a lawyerly society, and you sketched out some of the historical determinants of that. What are the pathologies you see in the lawyerly society, and what are the benefits that perhaps we may underestimate as well? And I think the comparison and the contrast with China illustrates both of those quite clearly. But sketch that out for us. What does the lawyerly society look like?
The first point that's really important to establish is that there is no great system between either of these. I think I do not want to be entirely ruled by engineers, nor do I want to be entirely ruled by lawyers. So the pathologies and the benefits of the lawyerly society, to start with some of these pathologies. At this moment, what are some of these great challenges facing America right now? Well, it's some degree of very high costs in a lot of material goods, especially in housing, especially in mass transit. There have been shortages of various manufactured goods. And I think that's an issue when you have a lot of lawyers, because the law makes it much more easy to stop a project than it is to really build a new project. We have a lot of laws on the books in which citizens are able to stop the construction of homes or apartments on the basis of noise pollution, light pollution, some sort of environmental issue, some sort of zoning issue. And I think that has been a challenge for America, not housing, not to build enough manufactured goods, to say nothing of building enough construction projects for the clean energy transition, which will require a lot of land for solar, for wind, for transmission grids, to build and decarbonize our economy. So that's one big issue. The other big issue I identify with a lawyerly society is that I think America is really good at protecting wealth, and it is not really great at building new wealth. And so you can't have these $4 trillion companies like NVIDIA is without having a lot of really extensive legal protections and rich people feeling safe, like they could, have a really wealthy company that has a really extraordinary corporate valuation. The problem with America is that it seems to work really well for the wealthy and the well-connected, but not necessarily very well for the middle class, or especially not the lower class. Manhattan has a housing shortage, but there are a lot of wealthy people who are able to build these super skinny high rises for themselves. It's really the poor that don't really have the ability to live in places where they may have jobs and don't have really functional mass transit in order to get to these jobs. And so I think that the problems of the lawyerly society are some of the problems that we have today, and inability to really tackle climate change at the speed that we need it to go, and also creating all sorts of material shortage. The benefits of the lawyerly society are that you don't have really authoritarian ideas like the one-child policy. Again, I keep coming back to this period in the 1980s when I think the Communist Party visited upon rural areas, a campaign I described as a campaign of rural terror, in which a lot of female bodies were violated, namely the mothers and the abandoned baby girls, through this series of forced sterilizations and mass abortions. And I think this is not something that is even conceivable that the United States could ever try to pursue. And I think the other big benefit that I'll mention is that in the United States, it used to be more of an engineering state back in the 1950s. And I think the US had a very good and worthwhile transition out of the engineering state, because the 1950s was a time when there was tremendous amount of environmental degradation. There was a tremendous amount of um, exhaustion with too much highway construction that ripped through various cities. America had become a warfare state at the time, and soon in the 1960s, it was involved in these big land wars in Asia. And Americans were tired of being sort of ruled by engineers with American characteristics at the time. And the lawyers really did do a good job of introducing greater environmental protection, greater civil rights protection, stopping, city planners like Robert Moses from ripping up New York. And so certainly there are plenty of benefits to really try to have more lawyers blocking really bad ideas.
And I thought your mention of Robert Moses, both here and in the book, was quite interesting. I think when people like you and me learned about Robert Moses, studied him in university, we studied all of the problems that came with his method of development. And yet, when you compare and contrast the U.S. and China, whether it's high-speed rail or highway development, there's a lot of people today who wish we had a bit more of the Robert Moses that we might have lost. And I guess I read you as sort of suggesting we should turn back the dial a little bit in the direction of Robert Moses, recognizing the pathologies that came with people like him, but also recognizing that if you don't have the highways being built or the high-speed rail being built in the first place, everyone collectively loses. Is that the right interpretation of where you'd land on the engineer to lawyer spectrum?
Yeah, I am a little bit of a Robert Moses revisionist. I think I am a Moses a fan, if only he could be a slightly more lawyerly. So I think I am, I think on net, slightly feeling like the discourse against Robert Moses has been excessively negative based on the magnificent, monumental biography, The Power Broker, Robert Moses, and The Fall of New York. I think the problem with a lot of our obsession with Robert Moses, especially stemming from the book by Robert Caro, which again is this miracle of archival, historical, journalistic work. The problem with the book starts with a subtitle, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. If we're taking a look at what is functional, what is the most functional city in America today, well, New York City has all sorts of problems. And, you and I, who both spend quite a bit of time in New York, would immediately be put off by the noise of its subways, the signs of public disorder, the lack of affordability. But New York City has been a highly functional city relative to a lot of other places. I spend quite a lot of my time in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where my wife teaches at the University of Michigan. 45 minutes away from us is the city of Detroit. And if you want to take a look at a city that has fallen, I would take a look at these Midwestern cities like Detroit and Cleveland, which have lost about 2/3 of their population since 1950. New York City has grown in population. It has continued to attract a lot of the brightest, highest paid Americans to live there. Its subway system is kind of a mess. Its infrastructure is kind of a mess. And I think the problem with New York is an underdeveloped infrastructure rather than excess infrastructure at the moment. And so I think the Robert Moses critique is very good of the time that we had this discussion in the 1960s. Right now, we need to think about whether we still need to continue stomping on Robert Moses' name, because perhaps we need a little bit more of a figure that is able to build quite a lot more infrastructure and especially clean tech around the US.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment, and I think it fits a broader intellectual trend that is bubbling up, I guess, in U.S. intellectual circles. On the left, you have sort of the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson Abundance book from a couple months ago, which makes sort of a similar argument in favor of a bit more building and a bit less of the lawyerly society. On the right, I think you could sort of see the Elon Musk strain of MAGAism in a similar vein, a sort of celebration of building and a criticism of the bureaucracy that holds building back. Do you think? Do you get the sense that the United States is at a turning point in this recalibration that you're advising, or maybe a couple books don't necessarily mark a broader shift in how society actually functions? What's your assessment?
Certainly I would say that books can have influence in society. For example, I would cite Chris Miller's Chip War as a book that has had a very tremendous and salutary effects on our public discussion. I think that it is an important question about whether the U.S. is going to be building quite a lot more. I think one of the benefits of the U.S., and I would say that the benefits of China as well, is that these countries are both always at turning points, and there is always a turning point that we can look forward to, and that is part of the dynamism that animates both of these superpowers. And I certainly want to suggest that China is a good model, not a great model, but a good model for thinking about abundance. And I've previously been on Ezra's podcast to gently tease him about this idea that, this idea of supply side progressivism, Ezra, isn't this something that China is practicing, that they are really abundant in terms of solar and wind and homes and manufactured goods. Now, I don't want to push this too far because China is hardly a progressive society. It's a state where workers have pretty limited rights, where the state is pretty authoritarian about making companies and workers do what are in the national strategic interest. And so I don't want to push this too far, but I would say that the US could learn some lessons from China, which has been able to build quite a lot and which has been able to solve a lot of the problems for society that are pretty important for China right now. And I would just say that the US doesn't have to copy China. There are many more plausible and better models that it can look to. It can look to, let's say, Japan, or it can look to Spain, or let's say France. These are all countries that have built subway stations, built high-speed rail stations, built wind turbines and solar at a much faster pace than the US. And it certainly doesn't have to go full China in order to solve its construction problems. There are much better models that we can look to in Western Europe as well as other parts of Eastern Asia.
Yeah, and it's a great point that China's abundant in certain things, has the opposite problem in many other categories. I think, certainly if you look at public transit or look at ability to build new power, China does really well, in part because that's been the focus of both policy and therefore of what businesses are building. If you look at household income, it's underperformed relative to what you might expect because it hasn't been a priority. And it seems to me that you conclude your book thinking that China is going to have a harder time rebalancing than the U.S. is. You write that it's harder to see China shifting away from the leadership from engineers. Can you talk about that? What are the challenges that China faces in terms of this type of rebalancing away from engineers towards a bit more lawyers, and what does that imply for China's political system and its economy going forward?
China faces all sorts of major problems that are not easily fixable. One is demographics. Another problem is debt. There are all sorts of headwinds right now for China's economy, in part because of excessive engineering. Now, the demographics are slightly worse. Demographers debate how much because of the brutality of the one-child policy, where a lot of people grew up with no siblings, and therefore it's becomes much more difficult for them to imagine having other siblings. China's economy is kind of a mess, in part because the Communist Party has tried to re-engineer society in order to get people out of building internet platforms and building way too much real estate in order to serve the national goal. And that sort of engineering has not always been very helpful. I think the reason that I'm somewhat more optimistic about the US is that I think one of the other great benefits of the lawyerly society is that lawyers are important guarantors of pluralism. And so lawyers are able to make sure that there are some more voices out there because you're able to really try to assert yourself if you have access to the law. And pluralism, I think, having this sort of robust debate is an important feature of reform and trying to get the world into a much better scenario. The other reason that I'm more optimistic about the U.S. is that the U.S. has had a tradition of of being an engineering state at various points in its time. Now, earlier, Chris, I mentioned that first 16 presidents, 13 of them were lawyers. Well, the other three, especially most famously George Washington, were generals. And for a lot of these military types, they have a pretty keen sense of national security. General Dwight Eisenhower was a young officer when he drove across America in the 1920s, juddering across these unpaved roads. It was a horrible experience for him. I think it's not surprising that when he became president in the 1950s, he really built out the federal highway system. And so there is kind of this sense in America that national security is still important. There needs to be some ability to build national security important goods, including something like semiconductors. And now we're discussing more rare earth magnets as well. And so the US has more of a heritage really to draw on to be able to recover its engineering chops, including from maligned folks like Robert Moses as well. And in China, there hasn't really been much of a lawyerly tradition. Now, we really have to strain to look at ancient political thought to find these evidence of liberalism, because in general, a lot of Chinese political thought is about maximizing the discretion of the sovereign, of the imperial monarch, and there isn't too much about trying to protect the rights of people, to protect the rights of businesses. That is a somewhat more difficult concept for China, and so I think it doesn't quite have this heritage to be able to draw on to make its society much better, whereas the U.S. does.
Well, it's interesting to hear you mention the security aspects of the U.S. engineering tradition, because that, I think, particularly relevant today as both the U.S. and Chinese leadership see themselves not just in a societal competition or economic competition, but also a security competition. And I guess the implication is that the security competition will push both the US and China to do more engineering. You described the sort of Eisenhower tradition, which I think makes total sense. You also in the book have a chapter on Fortress China, and Fortress China seems even more engineering focused than did pre-Fortress China. Can you walk us through that dynamic and how securitization has sort of counterintuitively led us to a China that's even more focused on engineering and building and the centralized dictation of preferences than we'd had a decade ago?
Yeah. So the Communist Party takes all sorts of security really seriously. It has since its founding, when it emerged out of this brutal invasion by Japan, and then in the Great Civil War against the Nationalist Party, which mostly fled to Taiwan. And in this sort of environment that was very significantly influenced by Stalin's Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party has always been tremendously, you can say, paranoid or fearful or vigilant or insecure about its security environment. And so they've always been, to some degree, interested in self-sufficiency in energy, self-sufficiency in food, self-sufficiency in manufacturing. That tendency has ebbed and flowed over the past few decades. It wasn't very strong when Deng Xiaoping reopened into the world and really tried to reintegrate China into the global economy. But that has become stronger once again to focus much more on domestic security under Xi Jinping since the last 13 years when he's been the top leader of China. And so, the Xi's agenda is really to emphasize a lot of energy security. I think this is part of the reason that China is going so hard on electric vehicles, in which 1 in 2 cars in China today is an electric vehicle. EVs are not necessarily much cleaner in China because a lot of Chinese electricity is produced by coal. In some senses, it is a pretty dirty product, but at least these EVs are burning domestic solar, domestic wind, and domestic coal rather than Middle East oil or Russian gas in order to power much of the broader power infrastructure. China is also really serious about food security, in which Xi is cultivating big grain fields in the desert rather than importing it from America because they're really nervous about this sort of supply. And again, as you know much better than me, Chris, China has been really focused on semiconductor sovereignty. This to more mixed success about trying to engineer its way into the future. And so one of these provocations that I want to throw out is that it looks pretty clear that the US has always been very focused on building national security. But over the last few years, it's become also pretty clear that America's defense industrial base has rusted to a pretty significant extent, which the US has a lot of trouble building ships, has a lot of trouble building munition. A lot of munition has been shipped to Ukraine, and the US hasn't really been able to rebuild its stock. What has been going really well for the US is artificial intelligence. And one of these provocations that I want to ask is, China's able to build all of these drones and it has no problem building munitions. The US has the AI. Well, if there's anything of a real conflict, what would you really like to have? Is it the algorithms and the software and the AI, or is it the actual munitions and the drones? And I think that's, no simple answers here, but I think this is something that the US should debate a little bit more.
I think that's a fantastic provocation on which to wrap up our conversation. I'll just conclude by saying what an honor it was to have a chance to discuss this with you, and so exciting to see the book out in the public sphere. I strongly recommend it, not just to anyone trying to understand China today, but also anyone thinking hard about the United States as well, since it's full of insights about both the engineering and the lawyerly societies. Dan, thanks so much for joining me. This has been an Intelligence Squared podcast. I'm Chris Miller. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time with us.